The Pacific is quite large and quite scary, not only because of some of the bizarre creatures that are home to these islands and the seas around them, but due to the sheer scale and isolation of the Pacific, giving rise to some of the world's most divergent and unique life forms. Similar to a Peter Jackson movie, before a species first settled these deadly and exotic islands, there existed a whole host of humanoid species that looked different, acted different, and were definitely built different than any humans we see alive today. Before we look at the modern people of the Pacific, we have to look at the very first inhabitants of this region, who were not in fact human beings as we understand them today. One of the first hominid species far predating anatomically modern humans in this region of the world were our hairier primitive uncle, Homo erectus, whose previous territorial range stretched all the way across Eurasia and into the cusp of Oceania, a landmass that is today referred to as Sundaland. Sundaland was a large peninsula jutting out from eastern Asia, encompassing the islands of Borneo, Sumatra, and Java, and was above water for millions of years until the end of the last glacial maximum around 20,000 years ago. Before we begin, let's take a look at today's sponsor and your internet access. It's getting more risky and inconvenient to browse the web nowadays, especially for those who live in countries that heavily restrict or monitor the web. So for the first time ever, I've decided to take a sponsorship. With Surfshark VPN, you can access any articles, data, movies, video, websites, and TV shows that would normally not be available in your location by allowing you to digitally change your location. It's actually been quite convenient for me to use in my research and data collection, and I imagine it would be even more convenient for those living in areas with more restrictive internet access. The best part is you can get it for absolutely free right now if you click the link in the description or in the pinned comment down below and enter the code Masaman. Yeah, I like that. For a free trial of Surfshark VPN that will last you 4 whole months. So if you think this product would be of use to you in the near or long-term future, or you just want to help me out so I can get more sponsorship opportunities in the future, feel free to check it out. Thank you all, and let's get back to the video. Before that time, a couple other hominids also came to call this region home, notably Denisovans, a species related to Neanderthal, and Homo floresiensis, or the Hobbit man, an exceptionally short hominid species, around 3 to 4 feet tall for adults, resulting from island dwarfism, a phenomenon that is exhibited in a number of entirely unrelated modern human populations in the same region. The exact date and timeline for the extinction of these species is highly debatable, although some anthropologists originally believed Homo floresiensis survived well after the arrival of the first Homo sapien migration into Oceania. More recent analysis shows that they may have gone extinct very quickly after our species stumbled upon them, and possibly even before that, as no evidence of interbreeding has ever surfaced in modern or prehistoric human populations in the region, and it's unclear if this was even possible due to the massive discrepancy for our most recent common ancestor around 2 million years ago, limiting genetic compatibility. Long story short, they went extinct and we didn't, and the region of Sundaland was continuously inhabited by humans for at least the past 40 to 50,000 years, making them the oldest known branch of surviving anatomically modern humans to have branched off from Africa, and hence one of the most genetically distinct and diverse population of non-African humans. The first peoples to have inhabited the region of Sundaland were very distinct from the modern Southeast Asians who have spread to the region in successive waves. The exact nature of the relationship between the indigenous people of this region with the prehistoric populations of Oceania and South Asia are still debated, although they are genetically somewhere in between the two. There isn't really a widely accepted modern term for the indigenous peoples here, as the Spaniards originally referred to them as negritos, meaning little black people, due to their diminutive stature. However, this is now considered pejorative and unacceptable by some. So for this video, I shall simply use the term Sundaic or Paleo-Sundaic to collectively refer to the indigenous peoples of the former region of Sundaland. Interestingly, most of these Proto-Sundaic populations, as well as Oceanian groups further east, exhibit one of the highest degrees of archaic hominid admixture out of any group of humans in the world, nearly all from the Denisovans, ranging from 5 to 7% of the genome in most Papuan, Australian Aboriginal, and Aita peoples. And despite being a minority of the overall gene pool, this Denisovan DNA has had profound impacts on their phenotypes. At the end of the last glacial maximum, tragedy befell Sundaland as a great flood swept across the land. Well, perhaps not a literal flood with the wall of water as is associated with supposed lost continents like Atlantis, but rather a gradual rising of sea levels due to the melting of polar glaciers that saw over half the land of Sundaland below water, creating the islands of maritime Southeast Asia. Successive waves of migration from other regions of Asia in the past tens of thousands of years have fundamentally altered the genetic composition of this root race of humanity, and few full-blooded individuals remain in modern Southeast Asia, with one exception. As waves of migrants from East Asia, starting with Austroasiatic and later Austronesian tribes, began to encroach further south into Southeast Asia in the past 5 to 10,000 years, these Sundaic peoples began to lose more and more territory, fleeing to the mountainous interiors of the Malay Peninsula and remote islands all across Southeast Asia. Their original languages became lost, and most of the so-called Negritos of Southeast Asia now speak either Austroasiatic or Austronesian languages, which have a large substratum from a previous long-lost family of languages indigenous to the region. The only group to have survived virtually untouched by these waves of migration were the Andamanese. The Andaman Islands are situated a few hundred miles off the coast of mainland Southeast Asia and were even separated from Sundaland during the last glacial period. Modern genetic testing has shown the Andamanese to have genetic links to both Oceanian and ancient South Eurasian populations, albeit interestingly without the same level of Denisovan admixture observed in neighboring populations, showing that the modern Andamanese were likely the first to split off from the ancient Southern Eurasian gene pool and are descended directly from the very first humans to settle on the islands 50,000 years ago. The origins of the fierce isolationism imposed by the native Andamanese against nearly all groups that attempted contact or settlement on their islands are today debated. Some suggest it may have been a cultural practice deeply ingrained into their society as a reaction to slave raids by Asians from the mainland. But whatever the reason, it has kept their culture and gene pool extremely isolated and, dare I say, pure from outside interference. As a result of thousands of years of expansion, conquest, and intermixing, the vast majority of Southeast Asians have varying degrees of this so-called Proto-Sundaic ancestry, which phenotypically distinguishes them from Northeast Asians, although of course this varies considerably by region, ethnic group, and individuals. Originating from Taiwan several thousand years ago, the Austronesians didn't just stop after settling nearly all of maritime Southeast Asia. They even spread as far as Madagascar off the coast of Africa, as well as pressing on into the intimidating expanse of the Pacific Ocean. The first Austronesians to settle in the islands of the South Pacific 2 to 3,000 years ago, a region referred to as Near Oceania as opposed to Remote Oceania, are now called the Lapita culture. Modern genetic studies tend to agree with the direct dispersion hypothesis rather than a gradual migration, as DNA analysis has shown that the first members of the Lapita society in Vanuatu were almost completely unmixed with the neighboring Papuans, meaning they migrated directly from either Taiwan, Southeast Asia, or possibly through Micronesia to the north. Since then, their descendants have spread out to nearly every single island of Oceania, and these Austronesian migrations into the islands of the South Pacific gave rise to several modern groups, the Melanesians, Micronesians, and Polynesians, with a significant degree of overlap between them and outside groups in the current age. The term Melanesian, Australo-Melanesian, or Australoid is sometimes used to refer to the entire race of Oceanians, so lumping in Australian Aboriginals, Papuans, and Southeast Asian Negritos. However, in a more restricted definition, Melanesian is sometimes used for the Austronesian-speaking peoples of Melanesia, which includes the natives of New Caledonia, Vanuatu, most of the Solomon Islands, and parts of Papua New Guinea. These are distinct from indigenous Papuans since they usually have a higher degree of East Asian admixture from the Lapita civilization, normally through the maternal line, which is likely how they came to speak Austronesian languages in the first place, despite being genetically closer to Papuans than other Oceanians. Fiji is a unique case, being a fusion of both Melanesian and Polynesian cultures, and is difficult to classify since their language is closer to Polynesian than other Melanesian languages. Micronesians inhabit the Micronesian islands, stretching from Palau in the west, the Mariana Islands in the north, and Kiribati or Kiribati in the east, and these islands were settled in various waves, and because of this, some languages of Micronesia, such as Chamorro and Palauan, are more distantly related to other Micronesian languages, and some of these various islands have very heterogeneous cultural and genetic compositions. Outside of the traditional Micronesian realm today, there exist a handful of islands to the south that historically had Micronesian settlements, such as the western islands of Papua New Guinea or Mapia Atoll in Indonesia, while during the colonial period, due to overpopulation on the small islands and atolls of Micronesia, Micronesians were resettled by the British to various islands in Melanesia, such as Rabi Island in Fiji or Wagina Island in the Solomons, both of which have a Micronesian majority today. Additionally, British officials wished to resettle Micronesians from the overcrowded Gilbert Islands to the Phoenix and Line Islands to the east, which had been uninhabited for centuries due to their isolation and other unfavorable geographic features. And although the Phoenix Island settlements largely failed, Christmas Island, or Christmas in the Line Islands, was a success and is now home to nearly 10% of Kiribati's population. There were also attempts to settle Hawaiians on the Line Islands by the U.S. government. However, these unanimously failed due to the outbreak of World War II. What's truly interesting is that the indigenous name used by Polynesians to refer to Polynesia is Polynesia in Hawaiian or Polynesia in Tahitian, and yet these names predate the word Polynesia, whose etymology is derived from Greek and wasn't coined until the 18th century by French explorer Charles de Brosse. Aptly named due to the fact that it has the most dispersed and numerous territories in Oceania, stretching from Hawaii in the north, Easter Island or Rapa Nui in the east, and New Zealand in the south, a region referred to as the Polynesian Triangle. Polynesians have the greatest degree of Eastern Eurasian admixture in Oceania, despite being the most geographically removed from any part of Asia, and hence many have pointed out that it is illogical to group them together with other Oceanians who are far more genetically distinct. Oceanian admixture among Polynesians generally ranges from 20 to 40%, and there is a clear sex-biased genetic ratio when looking at their maternal DNA, which is mostly Asian, and their paternal DNA, which is mostly Papuan, showing that the Polynesians arose mainly from miscegenation between native Papuan men and Austronesian women. Although it is still unclear whether this was through peaceful intermixing or violent conquest, this can partially be explained by the fact that most native Papuans are rather patriarchal and male-dominated, while many Austronesian groups are more matriarchal in their familial and societal structure by comparison, and hence modern Pacific Islanders have a combination of both of these cultures. There are numerous islands that are ethnically and culturally tied to Polynesia outside the traditional Polynesian Triangle as well, scattered throughout nearly every country of Melanesia and parts of Micronesia. These are known as Polynesian outliers. Some of the more significant Polynesian outliers include Renell Island, aka Mugaba, in the Solomons, and Uvia in New Caledonia, and some of these outliers have histories dating back thousands of years to the first Lapita arrivals, while others were settled more recently by Polynesian colonists from western Polynesian islands such as Tuvalu, Wallis and Futuna, and Samoa. Although each nation and arguably every island of Polynesia has a unique history and culture, the Polynesians are more or less united under the same pan-ethnic umbrella abroad, as most outsiders care little to learn about the nuances and history of the region. Various empires rose and fell in Polynesia and the Pacific over the past 1,000 years, particularly the Tongans and Samoans, who greatly expanded their influence to encompass massive swaths of the Pacific with the help of the maritime network of trade and communication, leading to cultural and familial connections between virtually every single island in the region. It has now been confirmed through genetic testing that Polynesians did indeed reach the Americas even before the Europeans did, as varying levels of Amerindian admixture in eastern Polynesian populations in the Marquesas Islands, Rapa Nui, and the Tuamotu Islands show that they had intermixed with Native Americans from across the Pacific coasts of North and South America. Despite most of the world being largely unfamiliar with the Pacific Islands, they are very familiar with the rest of the world, as virtually every island of the South Pacific was colonized at one point or another by a foreign power during the colonial age, oftentimes from very far away. Interestingly, although Austronesians managed to discover and settle nearly every single island in near and remote Oceania, they never seem to have settled on the mainland of Australia, which is puzzling, but various South and Southeast Asian powers seem to be aware of the continent's existence and may have had a minor contribution to their culture and gene pools over the last several thousand years. The first nation to have established contact with the natives of Australia in modern recorded history may have been the Portuguese in the 16th century, although this credit is mostly given to the Dutch 2 centuries later. Beginning in the 1500s with the Spanish colonizations of the Philippines and neighboring Micronesian islands, the islands of the South Pacific gradually began to fall one by one to various colonial powers. For centuries, the natives of the Pacific Islands were kidnapped, tricked, or bamboozled into effectively working as slave labor, a practice known as blackbirding, for various European empires and various overseas colonies, particularly the Spanish and the British. Although the British later outlawed this crime, it continued to be practiced covertly, possibly as recently as the early 20th century, and many Micronesian, Polynesian, and Filipino civilians were trafficked to Spanish America during the days of the Manila Galleon, and millions of Latin Americans have ancestry from them. It's important to recognize that contact with the Europeans and the outside world had alarmingly drastic effects on the local population, as within only a few centuries, the population of nearly all Oceania had been more than decimated, with the population dropping at a rate of nearly 90% on some islands, leading to the near extinction of many Pacific Island communities, a similar fate to what occurred to the indigenous peoples of the Americas, and this can be attributed to several factors. The first was disease, as the Pacific Islands ended up being en route for some pretty heavily trafficked global trade routes, bringing them in contact with diseases from all over the world to which they had no immunity, and this problem persisted for several centuries. The second was the introduction of Western arms and technology, which saw massive civil conflict erupting across the Polynesian islands, from Hawaii, Tahiti, Samoa, and especially New Zealand, where a raid by Maori warriors in the 19th century resulted in the genocide of the Moriori tribe of Chatham Island. The third was general abuse and brutality by various colonial powers, including pretty much all of them, from the aforementioned blackbirding by various parties to the reckless abandon of the British, French, and American governments, with several Pacific islands now left heavily irradiated and virtually uninhabitable due to the atomic bomb tests their governments conducted in the Cold War. And before that, the Pacific saw the literal enslavement of entire islands during the expansion of the Japanese Empire during World War II. Back when foreign islands were traded around like Pokemon cards, the Spanish took most of Micronesia, including the Mariana Islands. Polynesia and Melanesia were mostly divided between the British, French, and Germans, while the United States took Hawaii and Chile took Easter Island. Germany would later take Spain's Micronesian possessions, only to be lost to Japan after World War I. Imperial Japan attempted to settle these islands, with tens of thousands of Japanese civilians, largely Ryukyuans, settling in Micronesia, and later expanding to Southeast Asia and many other islands in the Pacific during the Second World War. But after being defeated, control of the Micronesian possessions passed on to the U.S., and nearly all Japanese settlers were expelled from the islands, But the mixed descendants of Japanese men and Micronesian women were allowed to remain, and they make up a substantial minority of many Micronesian islands, mostly being completely assimilated with the locals. Although most of Micronesia gained independence, they still remain an associate state of the U.S. to this day, and massive proportions of their citizens now reside in America, cementing the relationship between them. In the past few centuries, Oceania also went through a significant religious transformation as well, while the vast majority of islanders converted to either Protestantism, Catholicism, or increasingly Mormon churches or the Baha'i faith, and most islanders also incorporate some elements from their traditional mythology and animistic beliefs in their national holidays and religious and spiritual practices. During this time, Europeans migrated not only to Australia, New Zealand, and Hawaii, which received the vast majority of European migrants to Oceania by far, but also to some of these smaller islands, such as New Caledonia, Fiji, Guam, Tahiti, and others. But over time, these small and isolated communities increasingly intermixed with the locals across the entire region of the South Pacific. This process gave rise to an entirely new heterogeneous race in the South Pacific that never existed until this point, a group known broadly today as Euronesians, and today there are well over 1 million people worldwide of mixed European and Oceanian ancestry, although their exact ethnic heritage and predominant culture varies significant from community to community and island to island, with a number of Pacific islands having a distinct Euronesian history. The most famous of which is arguably the Pitcairn Islands, with Pitcairn Islanders later migrating en masse to Norfolk Island, closer to Australia and New Zealand. British and French authorities would later import large numbers of Asian migrant workers and political prisoners to their Pacific Island colonies, most notably in Fiji, where descendants of Indian migrants of various origins now number in the hundreds of thousands, and the Indo-Fijians have a unique culture and history among the Indian diaspora. Indonesians, mostly from Java, along with Chinese, Japanese, Vietnamese, and Korean workers, and some Arab prisoners were also brought by the French into Vanuatu and New Caledonia, and many other Pacific Islanders throughout Melanesia, Polynesia, and Micronesia have some recent Asian ancestry today, further adding to the genetic diversity and cultural heritage of the islands. Today, only central Polynesia is majority Polynesian, as due to heavy immigration to Hawaii and New Zealand, Polynesians are a minority in their homelands, and only 17 to 25% of individuals in the Polynesian Triangle are of Polynesian ancestry. Another factor leading to Polynesian depopulation was emigration, both forced and voluntary, as today over half of the native Hawaiian population lives in the mainland United States, and around a third of the entire population of the Polynesian Triangle now lives outside of the region, and nearly half of the population of Micronesia has also emigrated. The Pacific Islands currently have one of the highest emigration rates of any region in the world, with Hawaiians, Samoans, Tahitians, Tongans, Maori, Chamorro, Marshallese, and other Polynesians and Micronesians spreading out mainly to English-speaking countries around the Pacific, the mainland US, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. Melanesians and Papuans have a far smaller but not insignificant diaspora, despite being the most numerous indigenous people in the South Pacific by far. Many Melanesian nations, whose populations are growing rapidly, are still plagued by poverty, domestic strife, and extreme ethnic friction, especially in the underdeveloped highlands region of New Guinea, one of the most ethno-linguistically diverse regions in the world, with hundreds of distinct languages and where hundreds of individuals lose their lives to ethnic and tribal conflict each year. There have also been conflicts between the Indo-Fijians, European, and Indonesian settlers with the indigenous Papuans and Melanesians. West Papua, known in Indonesia as Irian Jaya, has a long connection with neighboring Indonesian empires and is currently divided between several provinces within Indonesia, and millions of Austronesian settlers from across Indonesia have settled there, although there are strong elements within the indigenous people of New Caledonia and West Papua that are still vying for independence. For instance, there have been no less than 4 independence referendums held in New Caledonia in the past 40 years, with the majority of natives, or Kanaks, voting for independence, while the Europeans and Polynesians on the island mostly support staying a part of France. West Papua has also seen a long string of political and ethnic violence aimed at further autonomy, complete independence, or unification with Papua New Guinea. The island of Bougainville is technically still a part of Papua New Guinea, despite being closer to the Solomon Islands, and has long vied for independence themselves, viewing the Papuan officials as exploiting the land and people of their island, and is set to gain independence sometime within the next several years, which will make it the world's newest country. It will certainly be very interesting to see how things play out within the upcoming decades and how the nations and cultures of this region evolve and interact over time. Please let me know your thoughts on the history and people groups of Oceania and which region of the South Pacific you have the most interest in learning more about. I know this video is much longer than usual, but in reality I didn't even scratch the surface of all the various historical events and modern cultural quirks that make every island in the area unique. Thank you all so much for watching. This has been Mason. I'll see you next time.